Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hi everyone. The 18th century artist Thomas Gainsborough makes another appearance in this series today. We last crossed paths with him back in December as the portrait painter of Charles Ignatius Sancho in our interview with the inimitable Patterson Joseph. Well, today's guest has just published her award-winning debut novel, The Painter's Daughters, which imagines the lives of Gainsborough's two children, Peggy and Molly, who suddenly find themselves uprooted from a rural Ipswich as their family relocates to the fashionable spa town of Bath. It's a deeply powerful, moving, and at times hilarious read. But there's a very special reason why today we are speaking to Emily Howes, the author of The Painter's Daughters, and that is because she is currently writing her second book, Mrs. Dickens, all about the life of Catherine Hogarth and her marriage to Charles Dickens. Emily is an alumna of Cambridge University, where she was a member of the famous Footlights. After gaining a first in English, she studied Lecoq at the London School of Performing Arts. She then went on to create work for theatre, radio and television, highlights including the two series of her show The Ladies for BBC Radio 4 and performing in Tim Minchin's Rocking On for BBC Radio 2. Emily is also a recipient of the Hans Cohn Scholarship for the study of existential psychotherapy. Emily, hello and welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. It's fantastic to have you here.
Oh, I am so excited. I'm a long-standing Brain on Fire fan.
That's so lovely to hear, really.
I really am. Yeah, it accompanies me on all my dog walks.
That's great. Well, you're here because you are in the process, I believe, of writing a new book, Mrs. Dickens. But before we dive into that, I have to talk to you a little bit about this book I'm holding here, which no one can see, The Painter's Daughters. Anyone who picks up this book, which came out in February, didn't it, in the UK and the US at the same time,
Yes.
Was it pretty much? Yeah. But at the very top is a quote from Hilary Mantel, the amazing Hilary Mantel, and she writes, beautifully written, I raced through it. And then something else that she says in the full quote, I think, is she describes it as a polished performance, which leads me on to my next kind of question for you, which is, what is the connection then between you as an author and Jack Lecoq and the Cambridge Footlights and directing shows?
Yes, that's where I began. I mean, I studied English at university, and when I came out, was quite confused about what to do next, and wanted to create something or be in the world of creating stories. And then I found this amazing school, which was a school for actors who wanted to write. It was a Lecoq sub-school, so the guy who ran Lecoq came to London and set up his own school, and a slightly different mentality to Lecoq, a little bit less hesitate to say threatening, but there's quite a strong dynamic at Lecoq, and it was a bit more of a nurturing environment based on the premise really that anyone can write. So if you walk in as an actor and you sit on a squeaky chair, you're already writing, you're making us laugh. How does the character react to the squeaky chair? That's already a process of writing. I just loved that about it. And you have to keep creating all the time. There's no director, there's no, you just get put into groups for a time called creation, and you just come up with something and you have to show it. So it takes all the fear out, and every time it's terrible or you failed, I really remember Thomas, the guy who led the school, would say, oh, we're failing, this is wonderful, why doesn't this work? Let's all look at why this doesn't work. And that idea of writing being completely democratic, open to anybody, very much faced in joy, in laughter, in tears. Can you make us laugh? Can you make us cry? Was kind of where I started. And also that it's a very much a sensual art form. It's a visual art form. It engages all your senses. That was really his understanding of physical theatre. And I think that really spoke to me, that we live in this world of being in bodies, and so storytelling and theatre from the body, I've absolutely carried that, I think, into writing novels.
Yeah, I think so. And and what I've been reading so far of The Painter's Daughters, you've passed what I look for in a novel with flying colours, which is, we all want writers to almost retell something that we know, but in a way that we've never thought of it before. So I just want to drill down on something. This might seem a bit strange, but I want to drill down on one tiny little piece very early on page 14, okay, where I think the two daughters, it's Peggy and Molly, isn't it? And they're squeezing through a fence, and Molly grazes herself, passing through the fence. Now, I think in most people's minds, you think of a graze, you think of a pinkish kind of colour or blood, potentially sort of beneath the surface. And you describe it as chalky. And I just thought, yes, that's right. That is what it is. Of course it is. In the first moment of a graze, in that living moment of it happening, it's a chalky impression on the skin. And I just thought that was brilliant. That put me right there with them in ways that I don't know if all writers would do. And I wonder whether it is connected to your theatrical, in the room kind of.
Yeah, that sort of writing from the immediacy of the moment is what really excites me. And to really enter that world, you feel like you're sort of crouching at the character's shoulders and moving through the world behind them, which is such a joy to do when you're looking at a world that's so immersive and so beautiful and full of detail. So you find a research moment. There's a moment a bit later on where one of the characters works briefly in a kind of pig shop in London, but it's with Peggy Molly's grandmother. She's sort of telling us the other part of the story. And I found this detail in a book where somebody was writing at their diary in this kind of pig shop that they had a chop house in London. And the pig was turning on the spit, and this guy was standing guarding it, turning it round and round. And he got this cloth and he just wiped down his armpits and then wiped the pig with the same cloth.
Oh, yeah.
And those kind of moments of history where you feel like, I mean, obviously it was going straight in as soon as I saw it because it's so evocative, that kind of grossness, the atmosphere, the smell of it. That's what I love about writing from history, and really that moment where it intersects with our physical response now and the feeling of really being there. That's what I love about it.
Moving now then to Mrs. Dickens. Where are you at with the writing of this now? What's been going on? What can you tell me?
So I'm about 80,000 words in, which in most cases would be pretty close to a complete novel. This is a first draft. I've been researching and writing for about 2 years. I've been all over the place. I've been to Lausanne, I've been to Genoa, I've been to every Dickens affiliated place around Gad's Hill. So I've been all over the place. Anywhere I can go that there's a Dickens link, which is surprisingly large portion of the UK. Been to Catherine Dickens's old house in Edinburgh, where she grew up. I've just been all over the place and reading everything and writing away. I'm at a kind of crucial point because at the moment I've got two stories in the mix. I've got Kate, Charles's wife, and then I've got Anne Brown, who was their trusted and loved servant who began working for them when she was a similar age to Kate, really, in Broadstairs. They were looking for a girl to help with the children, and Kate must have been in her early 20s, 22 or something, and Anne was about 18. And she was volunteered by her aunt, I think, and ended up going to work for them for the summer and then stayed with them really her whole life. She went everywhere with them. She went to America with them. She went to Genoa with them. Wherever they went, she went to. And what we know about her is that she had a daughter. She got married eventually, had a daughter and named her after Catherine and Georgina. Dickens paid for the education of her daughter, but then she went back to work for them because she married a guy who was a piano polisher. He wasn't very well. He had a heart condition, and she went back to be housekeeper at Tavistock House. And she was there when everything blew up between Catherine and Charles. And she was the person he wrote to ask to divide the bedrooms, to put a kind of wall down the middle of the bedrooms when his intentions were quite serious. And he was very much making a point about wanting to leave Kate or have a very separate life to Kate. So I was really intrigued by this idea. I was really intrigued by the idea that she was there all the way through it, watching this marriage unfold, and whether she might be able to give us a different perspective. But I don't know if she's going to stay in. She might find herself... I've written probably, 30,000 words of my 80,000 Anne story. I'm interested in it because I think it gives us in my version of it, she has a brother a small boy who she has to leave behind in a factory in order to go and take this job with the Dickenses. And so she's constantly wrestling with this moral choice of kind of ditching essentially this little boy in a horrible condition in factory work to go and have this life in this very wonderful upper middle class, exciting world where she gets to travel everywhere and have this freedom. And I love her being there. She gives us a different class perspective, which I really love. She gets to see Kate and Charles from a different angle, which I also love. But also it can touch on some of the themes that are important around philanthropy and around Dickens's relationship with young children in poverty. So she's there still for now. She's hanging in there. But I don't want her to steal all of Kate's thunder, because Kate, I would love to I just really want to get into her story, and I don't want her to be too much of a limp lettuce.
I did wonder how much, looking at Kate, Catherine, how much you considered her to be a doormat and how much she shows her own kind of... I don't know, I'm just remembering that Dickens wrote about one of their early travels in America, how, for a change, he was praising his wife, saying, oh, she was really up for stuff, she was really fun. I'm completely paraphrasing, obviously, but there's definitely a lot there. What, perhaps even with your psychotherapist, what are you seeing in Kate there?
Well, with my motherly hat on, for the majority of their 22-year marriage, she was pregnant. So for me, part of that is going to come from the fact that she wasn't for that moment. They'd had a little gap in having children, and the physical energy that must have given her at that time would be enormous. So I suppose what I would say is that she was raised for home. Her personality was very much a homely personality. She loved cooking. And certainly in my interpretation of her, and I think it's borne out really by the way Dickens writes to her. He was very paternal towards her in the early letters. And she was... Then he obviously loves a domestic woman. That's his dream woman, is the woman who is the woman of the home. So for me, it makes a lot of sense. That's how she would be. She was often described as like kind of having a slow, soft sort of energy, like slow moving eyes with heavy lids, and being very pretty and very calm and very composed. And I started to think, well, what is wrong with all those qualities? They're fabulous qualities, really. So there's lots of it I want to celebrate. The kind of sensuousness of being a cook, somebody who loves food, somebody who doesn't child would tear around, frenetically, which is also wonderful. She had a kind of opposite energy to that. And I partly wanted to write the book as a response to sort of just celebrate that kind of slow, gentle kindness that people describe her as having had. She's also quite fun. She's always doing really terrible puns, for example. And Dickens would like roll around on the grass, pulling at his hair on the beach, going, oh God, awful, awful, I can't bear it. So I thought that was a really interesting dynamic to look at. But also what I'm fascinated by is the way that she was raised for that and chosen for that purpose, to be the domestic woman. Yes. So she was raised to have the children, to do all of that. And from my side of it, it's a kind of look at how we raised women for such a long time to take that role. I mean, she was really genetically and socially engineered into taking up the role of the lovely Victorian wife, particularly because that was Dickens's thing, his very powerful character. But what happens to you over the course of a long marriage if you take that up, if you become the woman who has the children and stays at home? Ultimately, she got basically binned off by the time she was in her early 40s. She had 10 children with him, and the whole thing fell apart. And I would suggest that a lot of the social narrative around that is because she became fat, is because she became lazy, or because she was a bad housekeeper. And for me, it's about following Lillian Nader's footsteps a little bit and saying, well, hang on a minute, we've got pervading narratives here about who this woman was. Even actually in the Claire Tomlin biography, in the film of that, The Invisible Woman with Ralph Fiennes, we see Kate for a moment getting changed, and she's portrayed as somebody, and understand why, being a theatre maker, you've got to be quite sort of brutal with your storytelling to make sure you've got a good narrative arc. But in that film, she's seen as somebody who's not really got any interest in his writing, which is very much not true. She's really engaged, pretty well-read woman, passionate about his writing. He would read to her and she would cry at, the scenes of Nancy and have to leave the room. And she was very, very much engaged in his career. And so that was wiped out. But also there's this moment that really stays with me where we're supposed to see from this shot of Ralph Fiennes as Dickens sort of with his quill by candlelight, and he glances up and sees his wife getting changed, and they just look at each other for a second, and you can tell that what we're supposed to see is this fat, unattractive woman, and that it all makes sense, that he looks up and he's a bit embarrassed, and we look away again, and off he goes to his beautiful young actress who understands his creative genius. And that even now, that's a contemporary picture of how we see this relationship. And I suppose I'm trying to reclaim a little bit, or explore a little bit, the idea that we all seem to carry, that as a woman's body changes, she becomes less romantically interesting, or it's more understandable that she might be dismissed. So that's part of it. When you don't fit that perfect Dickensian, nice little dumpling of a wife, and you actually shift outside that, because who can sustain that for the whole of a long marriage? What happens?
And all the time you've been talking about that, I've been sort of thinking special things about the fact she's born in Edinburgh. And as you said, you went to her house. Did she have a kind of genteel Edinburgh accent throughout her life?
She did.
I just wondered whether there's something in the dynamic there as well. Yes, there's a cultural thing, isn't it? Scottish accents are used all the time on helplines, aren't they? because they reassure people. There's something clear and precise and understated sometimes in the delivery. I don't know if there's anything in that. I don't know.
I feel like as a character, when I find her talking, and Anne, of course, is one of the only people who hears her talking at the moment, and that softness of her Scottish brogue that we wouldn't...
I have to say, I'm very interested in Anne as well. I mean, I haven't read the manuscript. I'm just saying, if you feel like you want to keep her, I mean, please keep her, because it's fascinating to have this vantage point, this way in.
Yeah, there's something really lovely about it, because when she first sees them at the moment in my book, they're down, she's on the cliff at Broadstairs, and the family's down on the beach and they're playing, and it looks like they're kind of in a dumb show almost, or a theatrical performance, which is sort of how Dickens wanted to live his life. He performed his life. He cast people in roles around him, and that's how he, in my understanding of him, that's very much how he was. So she has this sense of this performance that's going on, and Kate is the lovely, charming wife, and she's laughing away, and that he's, marauding around with the children on his shoulders and tearing up and down, on doing sort of clown tumbling on the sand. And he had that side to him that was this wonderful performance of joy, which he did incredibly well and obviously loved. But as the kids grew older, I think you probably have spoken a lot about the Dickens children. As they grew older, he became quite disengaged with them. He saw them actually as being too much like her. They weren't enough like him. They weren't energetic enough. They were lazy. They wouldn't pull their... I think he said at one point, you don't know what it's like to look around your dining table and see not one face that will do anything for itself. So he felt very burdened by particularly the boys. And they had very sort of generally not particularly successful lives, or some of them really met with disaster. They inherited a lot of the problems with debt and financial responsibility, a couple of them. Both Dickens believed that was a kind of failing, a kind of character failing they didn't overcome. So the performance started to wane quite a lot of this sort of joyful father when things didn't go the way he wanted, or where they didn't play the role that he wanted. There wasn't a huge amount of understanding or compassion around that. Anne Brown, I think, can see with a little bit more sharpness the way that Dickens is. And I wanted her, I don't know if she still will, to have that line, a slightly more contemporary response, because we're very close up on Kate and her story and how she's feeling, and just beginning to notice these ways in which she feels uncomfortable in the marriage, or as he referred to them, even jokingly, as bully and meek. And he considered himself to be at points quite quilpish about Kate, and to be quite bullying, and he was aware of it, that she was very gentle. And I think that dynamic is what essentially went wrong, that the more she was gentle with him, the more he played up, and then it led to this sort of great midlife crisis.
Yeah. In the narrative then, where you have Anne there and you have Kate,
yeah,
are we seeing it in the first person through either one of those characters or both of those characters? How does that work?
Yeah, at the moment through Anne. So
Right.
Anne is carrying, when we meet her, I'm talking so much about Anne, I feel like I can't now go away this afternoon and take her out.
Influencing you right now.
So yeah, when we meet her, she's kind of carrying a lot of the regret of what she did to Kate. So ultimately at the end, she stays with Dickens in reality. And I wondered what that must have been like for her she had to, who knows whether she wanted to or not, but to have had this friendship with Kate all the way through their lives, to have looked after her children, to have named her daughter after her, and then to be the one who's told to divide the bedrooms. I imagine having a husband who couldn't work and a daughter who needed looking after, she really would have, there's not a lot of money that Kate went away with, so staying and being the housekeeper at Tavistock House was insecurity, and ultimately he went on to pay for her daughter's education. So it feels to me as though, my interpretation of it is, what must that be like to have this choice? And for me, Dickens had a huge amount of control and power of the story, and he even used Anne in the violated letter. I think that he said something like, a certain female servant of ours will vouch that Kate wasn't a very good wife, but we have struggled and we're completely incompatible. He really spoke for her, then secretly released that. Yeah, I was wondering what it might be like to be caught in the middle of that, and if it might help me reflect something of how much power Dickens had. And he would say to the kids, well, the most valuable asset you have is my name. So they felt as though they were pressured to, even though he would say, oh, you can see your mother whenever you like, there's no holds barred, there was a real disapproval when they did. And he instilled in them that what he had to offer was more valuable. So I'm curious about that power that he held and what that must have done to people around him, and how much he could influence what they did.
That decision late on then in their marriage to divide the bedroom, that is extraordinary, isn't it? It's not commonplace, is it? You don't tend to hear of people ever doing that. I know that Claire Tomalin has suggested, because obviously there's that idea that Dickens may or may not have tried to have had Kate committed to an asylum.
Mhm.
What is going on for Dickens? Claire Tomlin suggests that he himself had gone a bit mad by that point in his life. What do you think? What's going on?
Yes, I think it was a colossal frustration. I think that's the feeling I get, that he was struggling with aging. He's so energetic and so full of life. And I think the slowness and what he would have seen as, I suppose, laziness and the burden of the people around him was really overwhelming him. And he was burdened. I mean, he was always drained financially by his own father, by his brother Fred. Then he had 10 children to look after. He had many, many financial drains. So I can understand where this kind of furore comes from. Then he meets the young actress who fits so perfectly with his Katie Perugini, his second oldest daughter, said something like she came into the life of hardworking Charles Dickens like a sort of balm, or a kind of she just sort of glided into his life. And I think there's something about, for me anyway, it's like, well, he was obsessed really with women who were domestic, which I think Michael Slater writes really well about in Dickens and Women. He talks a lot about Dickens's personal taste, but also what he sees as goodness. And Kate had just slipped so far from that. She was quite ill. She had really bad headaches. They lost Dora, but also she'd just been pregnant, and traveling and pregnant, and was just putting on all this weight. And for me, there's something about this kind of lovely, young, perfect Dickens woman coming into his life, and there being a possibility there that just sent him a little bit crazy, that he would throw anything under the bus in order to get more of that and have that again, as if it was an answer. He was also frenetically looking for that kind of answer for quite a long time. Maria Beadnell is a good example, that he reconnected with this first love, and he expected her to be this lovely, dainty, gorgeous little woman, and she wasn't that. She was quite similar to his wife, and that she was middle-aged, and that I think he thought she was silly. Maybe she was, I don't know, but he was horrified by the sight of this woman who he'd expected to be so young and dainty and lovely. So there's something for me going on about Dickens and Women all the way through his life. He's looking at other women, whether that's, this girl Eleanor Christian on the beach at Broadstairs, and Kate's laughing along, and he ruins her dress by pulling her into the water.
Yes.
And such a great account of how he was with... Yeah,
that's a really illuminating, because does she describe in that moment, talking about how, my clothes are not costumes in his fantasy kind of thing. This is real silk that he's ruined or something.
Yes, and his wife was saying, you have to buy her another dress, and he wouldn't. And Eleanor was screaming under the, get me out, get me out of here, you're going to ruin my dress. My dress. She was crying, really crying. And he wouldn't let her go until he'd really ruined her dress. He pulled her under a couple of waterfalls on that same holiday, and she said she was terrified of him, but also absolutely enamored of him. And she would move. Sometimes when he was on his daily walk, he would smile at her and her friend and be the most charming and flirtatious. And then another time he would storm past them as if they weren't there at all. And he refused to see drawings that she'd done when she went to visit them in London. She thought he might like to see a couple of the drawings she'd done of him, and he wouldn't. And Kate was very embarrassed, and she heard Dickens basically say, no, thank you, I'm not interested. Why would I want to see those? And Kate had to come back in and apologise for him, and was red in the face. And so there was a really sort of hard side to him where his charm would kind of evaporate very quickly. And she expressed a kind of terror. Eleanor Christian is such a great account of how he was. Wonderful joy, great gamesman, full of fun, life of the party, but then also with this darker side. But it was flirtatious, and you can see that, I think. He describes women, in America, I think he says, she may be the more handsome, but this other one is the more kissable. He was quite vocal about his attraction to women. So for me, the sliding into place of Nellie Turner right at the end there is this moment where he can no longer, he's been looking so much to fulfill that part of himself, which Kate is no longer able to do. And she's so much not a fit with what he wants. He can't bear that and has to look elsewhere for it. And that becomes a sort of fervour. And also he was so hardworking and so prolific and so energetic. It doesn't really surprise me that that was almost impossible to sustain. So by the end, he was not quite where he was at the beginning.
Yeah. How on earth do you set about putting pen to paper on something like this? I heard an interview with Robert Harris a long time ago, and he describes about how in his regimen of writing, he does 6 months research and then 6 months writing, and it just seems so kind of fixed. But how is your routine for writing novels?
Well, I've only done it once before, and this is my second go. But I would say that you really want to have a good grounding and a kind of absorption in everything you're writing about, enough to give you a sort of imaginative springboard. So if your imagination is fired up, you're ready to go, and then you need to research as you go. And quite often I'll come across things and think, oh my goodness, I like at one point when I was writing The Painter's Daughters, I realized that Gainsborough shut all the shutters and blinds and everything in his studio and only painted by candlelight so he could change the lighting. So he wanted to keep the lighting perfect. And I didn't realize that to begin with. And I found that detail quite late and had that moment of shock where I realized that I would have to go back and make sure that was accurately represented. So I think if you read a sort of first draft, you'd probably be horrified at, wrong ages and wrong years and sort of slightly wonky details. But if the feeling is there of if you've got enough to feel from, whether that's Kate in the kitchen or whether that's them on the beach and looking down from Broadstairs, or what Broadstairs beach is like at night with those kind of great hulking bits of white rock or whatever it is you find, that just sparks you. I think it's just getting a spark, really. Once you've got a spark, then you can start to work.
I suppose with the Gainsborough family, there's little less to go by. So you have that space perhaps to fill in some blanks. Whereas with the Dickens family, people go, oh, no, in 1847, he was definitely at this place at this time. And then he went on to do a speech at the,
Absolutely. That's so much a challenge of this book compared to the first book, because Gainsborough himself is not, he was kind of a jobbing portrait painter and not so very much exists or was kept for posterity, partly because it's 100 years earlier and partly because Dickens was a massive celebrity in his lifetime. So everybody kept everything he ever sent or touched or would publish their own memories of him. There's just endless amounts of information. So I have found that to be quite challenging because there's much more to inspire. There's so many details that I just absolutely love that will never be able to make it in. Like when Charlie Dickens, his son, said goodbye to him when he was dying, there was a smell of flowers coming in from the window. I can't remember which flowers they were. And he was never able to smell that scent again without thinking about his father. So there's so many things, these little moments that are perfect for a writer, that if you're not careful, and you could write, a 7-volume novel based on them all, there's much more. And even Dickens himself, not only have you got all his novels, he was just the most prolific letter writer, so hundreds and hundreds and articles and all sorts of things. And he was contradictory, and he contradicts himself a lot of the time in what he's writing. So you've got to be really careful and trying to stick very closely to Kate's version of things, to try to stick to Kate's experience. There's less there. I've still got a whole book of letters from him to her, and to just be as careful as possible about what I conflate and what I keep in. That's going to be the challenge of this book, for sure. The only problem with it is that I don't want Kate to become this figure of great sadness, because almost everything we see of her, and so much I'm interested in that happens to Kate, particularly I think the death of Mary early on, what that's like, because Dickens became very controlling of that death and very demonstrative in his grief about the death of Kate's sister. And he took her ring and wore it for the rest of his life and said he wanted to be buried in the same grave as her at Brompton. But it's really a member of Kate's family who came with Kate. So trying to show that, which again is a kind of tragedy, that the death of Mary, and she had a miscarriage shortly after that. And then there's the birth of Charlie, which was so difficult. And she had these periods of postnatal depression after that. She couldn't breastfeed him, and she felt intense guilt and not being able to breastfeed. But there's quite a lot for me in Kate's story of going into this marriage with her eyes so open and her sort of wonderful, my wonderful husband and the wonderful life we're going to have, pure, totally in love at 19, ready for this world. And then the realization of how complex and painful and difficult both marriage and parenting and mothering are, and the tax and the toll that it takes on you as you go through it. That feels like a really interesting trajectory for her. I would really love her to have a kind of moment of hope at the end. She was very short-sighted, for example. She couldn't see very well. She was bumping into things and wouldn't wear glasses. And I think Lillian Nader suggests that maybe she just didn't want to have them on because she didn't think they looked very good at 19 or however old she was. She was a bit vain about it. So in my book, she doesn't want to wear them because doesn't want to look bad in them. And so she goes through her life slightly just bumping into everything and kind of not quite able to see things. And I would really love her to have, and I've written it already, but I don't know if it'll make it in, but to have this moment where when she's basically on her own and Dickens is gone and everything seems so totally black, to be able to put on these spectacles in her garden and just see everything for the first time, kind of the moon sharpen and the leaves around her become distinct, and that sense of, even though everything has been destroyed and she's lost so much and she's living this sort of awful half-life where she can't really be with her children, she begins to discover a little bit of something of herself when she's not always attached to trying to hold on to Charles.
Yeah.
I've got a sort of sense of where I want it to go. The book is kind of about a bittersweetness to life that she learns as she goes through it, that what seems straightforward, a love story, actually becomes complicated and darker and more painful, and that her love for Charles is both a great joy of her life, and she remains in love with him to the end. I think she said to her daughter, share his letters, because then the world will know he loved me once. So she really was in love with him, thinking about him. He walked into the theatre at the same time as her and she burst into tears and had to leave. So there was a real love for him all the way through to the end. But I also wonder if there might be something in finding her value, because she wasn't ditched and forgotten by the people that she'd known. And at the moment, I'm looking at the idea that she thought she would be cast out because he had cast her out, that he was the only one with the power. He betrayed her publicly with the violated letter. There was a lot of talk about them. I think it would seem likely that she would think she would be socially ostracized, being detached from the celebrity of the relationship. But actually, a lot of people rallied around her, and she ended up, having the Millet children over, and they would come and play in her house, and she had all sorts of wonderful visitors. Harry Beach Stowe, I think the Thackeray stayed close to her. So the idea that she begins to realise that perhaps she isn't completely cast off and can have a life and is valued for her kindness. Lots of people stood by her in really lovely ways. That sense of all her life, she tries to hold on to the coattails of Charles, and she's proud of him and loves him, but also he hurts her a lot, and just trying desperately to avoid this calamity of him going, which seems almost impossible in Victorian times that he would go, but he does. And even when he's gone, this great love, she still is able to find a kind of acceptance and realise that she can hold her head high, and that she is little ideas about, perhaps, because he's very controlling of the domestic environment. He wanted everything just so. He ordered everything. He would say what colour the paint should be and how it should be put on and where to buy the chickens and blah, blah, blah. He was very much involved in all the details, and how that might have been to be free again. For such a brilliant cook and for such a kind of domestic woman to be able to say, I think I've got a moment where I've sort of sketched out where Annie Thackeray thinks that she'll come and visit, maybe she'll bring the children, and Kate starts to think, well, maybe they would like, the jam tarts that so-and-so one of her children used to like, and maybe I could walk out and get some fruit, and maybe I could get a tea set, that one that I saw that Charles didn't like or didn't want me to have, and maybe there's something about, I wanted to end with all of those things in place. The sense that she really did love him, was absolutely bereft at the loss of him right to the end. So there was a great sweetness in that, but also a great sort of sadness in that. She ends up going back to Gad's Hill because Charlie bought Gad's Hill, was the eldest son. He was the one who said he would stay with her. So when she left, he was able to decide where he wanted to go. He was quite charming, Charlie. He was quite a kind of affable, charming chap. And he managed to stay friends with both parents, but also to say, I will go and live with my mother. And he was the one right at the very beginning when she couldn't breastfeed, and she thought he would never love her. And he was the one coming with her to the new house and saying, I will stay by you and stand by you. And after Dickens died, the house was obviously passed down to all of the children as a collective, but Charlie went and bid against them to buy Gad's Hill for himself, which he did. And they were all horrified at him and thought this was such a betrayal that he would go against his own family, his own estate, in order to have it. But he got it. And so I kind of imagine Kate, this house that became so symbolic for Dickens of his future perfect storybook life, where it was the house that he was shown when he was a little boy, standing on the hill with his, I don't know where the hill would be actually now, having been to Gad's Hill. But in my mind, It was standing on a hill, looking at the beautiful house and thinking one day, as Dad saying, one day you could have it. I have them going back there on their honeymoon and Charles telling her the story, and it becomes this wonderful sort of emblem of family happiness and contentment with all their children. And she's there for a year or two, and it's still being renovated, and then he boots her out. So she never really makes it to this domestic paradise where she's the grandmother surrounded by the children. But then when she does, at the end, it's with this darkness that has come from Dickens projecting her, but she's still there.
Gosh, just hearing all of this, Emily, it just reminds me again of the power of fiction to really bring things to life, the real things to life, things that we know that happened. It's wonderful. And thank you so much for being so open and sharing so much the process that you're going through right this second with this book.
I don't know if the whole thing will change completely by the time it's finished, but
if it does, I mean, it's so interesting to sort of have this marker recorded of where you're at right this second at this point in April 2024. Obviously, the listeners all need to go out and buy The Painter's Daughters. If they haven't yet, they need to read that. Thank you so much, and I wish you all the very best, and I really look forward to reading Mrs. Dickens. It is called Mrs. Dickens now. Have you set that title?
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thanks again, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. It's honestly been such an honour.
Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Thanks, Dominic.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much, and see you next time.